Imagine a place, not born of political decree or economic ambition, but forged in the very heart of eternity. A city whose stones whisper tales older than time, a city destined to become the crucible of divine promise, the eye of the storm, and the very heartbeat of prophecy itself. Before kings ruled or empires rose, before the world ever heard the name Jerusalem, the spiritual threads of its destiny were already being woven. What if I told you that this city, so often at the center of global conflict and spiritual fervor, wasn't merely a strategic location, but a chosen vessel, a sacred stage for God's unfolding drama? Today, when we hear Jerusalem, images of ancient walls, holy sites, and modern tensions flood our minds. But what if there's a deeper truth beneath the surface? What if its story isn't just about battles and buildings, but about a covenant, a divine love story, and a promise that stretches from the dawn of creation to the end of days? Welcome to the untold narrative of Jerusalem, a spiritual saga disguised as history. To truly grasp Jerusalem's profound significance, we must peel back the layers of time, beyond the headlines and modern maps, and return to moments that most have forgotten, yet still shape every unfolding event. It began not in bustling markets or grand palaces, but in the quiet, almost mythical era of patriarchs, a time when God walked closely with humanity. Do you remember the enigmatic figure of Melchizedek, the priest-king of Salem? A name shrouded in mystery, yet carrying an immense spiritual weight. Genesis 14:18-20 records a pivotal encounter. Abraham, the patriarch of faith, returning victorious from battle, is met by Melchizedek, king of Salem, who brings forth bread and wine and blesses Abraham, calling him priest of God Most High. This ancient Salem, whose name means peace, is widely believed to be the earliest form of Jerusalem. Think about that. Even before Abraham's descendants would lay claim to the land, God had already placed a priestly king, a shadow of the Messiah, in this very location. It wasn't an accident. It was a divine anointing, a foretelling of the sacred purpose of this future city. But the full story of Jerusalem, as the chosen capital, truly begins with a man after God's own heart, David, a shepherd boy turned king. David understood the spiritual pulse of his nation. He knew that for Israel to truly embody its calling, it needed a spiritual heart, a place where God's presence could dwell among his people. At that time, the Jebusites, a non-Israelite people, held the formidable fortress of Zion, a seemingly impregnable stronghold that had defied capture for centuries. Can you imagine the challenge? A city perched on hills, surrounded by deep valleys, seemingly invincible. Yet David, guided by divine purpose, saw not an obstacle, but an opportunity for God's plan to unfold. In 2 Samuel 5:6-9, the narrative shifts. The Jebusites, confident in their defenses, taunt David, believing their blind and lame could defend their walls. But David, fueled by faith and strategic brilliance, captures the stronghold of Zion, and it becomes known as the City of David. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was a spiritual reclaiming. He made it his capital, but more importantly, he began to transform it into the spiritual center of Israel. Why this city? Why Jerusalem? Because it was centrally located, easily defensible, and most crucially, because God had chosen it, not for its strategic advantage alone, but for a deeper, eternal purpose. It was a blank canvas, ready to be imprinted with divine will. David's greatest desire for Jerusalem wasn't a grand palace for himself, but a permanent dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence among his people. For centuries, the Ark had moved from tent to tent, a constant reminder of Israel's nomadic journey. But now, with a settled kingdom, David longed to bring the Ark to Jerusalem, to establish a fixed sanctuary where the divine glory could reside. Think about the spiritual fervor of that moment, a king, filled with passionate devotion, dancing before the Ark as it was brought into his city, 2 Samuel 6:14-15. It was an unprecedented act of worship, a declaration that Jerusalem was not merely a political capital, but the spiritual nexus of the universe. However, God had a different plan for the building of the physical temple. Though David's heart was pure, his hands had been stained by war. In a beautiful paradox, God told David that his son, Solomon, a man of peace, would build the house for his name. Can you imagine the mix of emotions David must have felt? Disappointment, perhaps, but ultimately profound submission and joy that his lineage would carry out this sacred task. This revelation only solidified Jerusalem's divine appointment. It would be the place where the Most High would choose to dwell, a tangible connection between heaven and earth. David then dedicated himself to preparing for the temple's construction. He gathered vast quantities of gold, silver, bronze, iron, timber, and precious stones, transforming his dream into a detailed blueprint for his son. He passed on the divine blueprint to Solomon, a testament to his unwavering faith and his understanding of Jerusalem's unique destiny. He saw beyond his lifetime, beyond his own reign, recognizing that Jerusalem was not just his city, but God's. It was the place where the ark would find its permanent home, where the sacrifices would be offered, where the praises would ascend. This city was being set apart, consecrated, marked by heaven for a role unlike any other on earth. So, as we close this first chapter, consider this profound truth. Jerusalem's story is not a random collection of historical events. It is a deliberate, meticulously planned narrative woven by the hand of God long before its walls were raised. It began with a mysterious priest king, found its heart in a passionate warrior king, and was destined for unimaginable glory under a king of peace. It was chosen. It was set apart. And its journey from an ancient Jebusite stronghold to the undisputed spiritual capital of God's chosen people was just the beginning. The stage was set for a divine dwelling, a place where heaven itself would descend. Are you ready to witness the astonishing glory that would soon fill its sacred spaces? Imagine a city shimmering under the ancient sun, adorned with the finest gold, cedar, and marble. A city where the very air thrummed with a sacred energy, where the presence of the Almighty was said to dwell among His people. This was Jerusalem in the time of King Solomon, a period of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and unparalleled spiritual glory. What if I told you that during this era, Jerusalem was not just the capital of a powerful kingdom, but the literal earthly dwelling place of God's manifest glory, a tangible link between the human and the divine? After David, his son Solomon, chosen by God and endowed with extraordinary wisdom, took on the monumental task of building the temple. This wasn't merely a construction project. It was the realization of a divine dream, the fulfillment of a promise made generations ago. Can you imagine the anticipation, the sheer awe as the finest craftsmen and materials were brought together, not to build a palace for a king, but a house for the King of Kings? Every detail, from the dimensions of the Holy of Holies to the intricate carvings of cherubim, was meticulously designed according to God's precise instructions, as revealed to David. It was a masterpiece of devotion, a physical representation of Israel's covenant relationship with God. The construction of Solomon's temple, detailed in 1 Kings chapters 6 through 8 and 2 Chronicles 3 through 7, was an undertaking of epic proportions, lasting 7 years. The scale and grandeur were unlike anything the world had ever seen. The interior was overlaid with pure gold, gleaming, reflecting light as if radiating divine glory. Cedar wood, imported from Lebanon, adorned its walls, carved with exquisite designs of gourds and open flowers, making every surface a work of art. 2 massive bronze pillars, Jachin and Boaz, stood at the entrance, symbols of strength and establishment. Within the Holy of Holies, 2 colossal cherubim, carved from olive wood and overlaid with gold, spread their wings, their tips touching, overshadowing the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the tablets of the law, Aaron's rod, and a pot of manna, tangible reminders of God's faithfulness and provision. This was more than a building. It was a theological statement, a divine invitation for communion. But the true essence of the temple was not its physical splendor, but the divine presence it was meant to host. The moment of dedication, recorded in 1 Kings chapters 8 and 2 Chronicles 7, remains one of the most breathtaking events in biblical history. Solomon, standing before the vast assembly of Israel, stretching his hands toward heaven, offered a magnificent prayer of dedication. He acknowledged God's omnipotence, his transcendence, yet also his condescension to dwell among his people in this sacred space. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? 1 Kings 8:27. Yet he prayed for God's eyes to be open toward this house night and day, that God would hear the prayers of his people offered from this place. And then, in a moment of unparalleled glory, God responded. As Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. The priests could not enter because the glory of the Lord filled it. Imagine being there, the overwhelming light, the palpable presence, the weight of the divine. The people of Israel, witnessing this spectacle, fell on their faces to the pavement, worshiping and praising the Lord, declaring, "He is good, his love endures forever." This was the golden age of Jerusalem, a period when the covenant seemed fully realized, when God's promise to dwell among his people was manifest in breathtaking reality. This temple became the spiritual epicenter of the nation, the place where forgiveness could be sought, where communion with God was established through sacrifices, and where the divine word was proclaimed. Pilgrims from all corners of Israel, and even from other nations, traveled to Jerusalem to worship at this magnificent sanctuary. It was the heart of Israel's identity, the symbol of God's enduring faithfulness to his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The fame of Solomon's wisdom, combined with the splendor of the temple, drew visitors from distant lands, like the Queen of Sheba, who came to test Solomon with hard questions, and left utterly astonished, declaring, "The half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass the report that I heard." 1 Kings 10:7. Jerusalem, with its magnificent temple, truly became a light to the nations, reflecting the glory of the God of Israel. However, even in this era of unparalleled glory, the seeds of future decline were subtly sown. Solomon, despite his wisdom and the profound privilege of building God's house, eventually strayed. He accumulated vast wealth, horses, and most crucially, many foreign wives who turned his heart to their gods. This was a direct violation of God's commands, a slow, insidious drift from pure devotion. The very king who dedicated the magnificent temple, who experienced the tangible glory of God, allowed idolatry to creep into the heart of his kingdom. Can you see the paradox? The physical manifestation of God's presence was magnificent, yet the spiritual commitment of its keeper began to waver. This subtle shift, this gradual turning away from absolute devotion to God, would have profound consequences. The covenant made at the temple's dedication was conditional. Obedience would bring blessing and continued divine presence. Disobedience would lead to judgment and the removal of God's favor. Though the temple stood as a testament to God's enduring presence, the hearts of the people, following their king's example, began to drift. The gold of the temple remained, but the spiritual gold of sincere worship began to tarnish. So, as we conclude this chapter, we stand at the zenith of Jerusalem's glory, a city blessed beyond measure, housing the very presence of God, a beacon of light in the ancient world. Yet the question lingers: could such a glorious era truly last? Could the human heart, prone to wander, maintain the purity of devotion required to sustain such a divine dwelling? The stage was set, not just for continued blessing, but for a profound test of faith, a spiritual decline that would eventually cast a long, ominous shadow over the Golden City. What would happen when the heart of the nation began to turn away from the very God who chose them, and the very temple built for his glory? The answer awaits in the darkening chapters ahead, a chilling reminder that divine favor, though freely given, comes with profound responsibility. Imagine a city once bathed in divine glory, now shrouded in a creeping darkness. A city where the sacred songs of worship are slowly replaced by the unsettling hum of idolatrous rituals. This was Jerusalem after the Golden Age of Solomon, a slow, painful descent into spiritual apostasy, where the light of God's truth flickered, threatened by the encroaching shadows of human rebellion. What if I told you that the very temple, built with such devotion and filled with God's glory, would become a witness to its people's betrayal, ultimately leading to unimaginable destruction? After Solomon's reign, a profound shift occurred. The kingdom divided, splitting into Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital, and Israel. This division wasn't just political. It was a spiritual rupture, a weakening of the unified covenant people. While the northern kingdom of Israel quickly plunged into rampant idolatry, Judah, though it had the temple and the lineage of David, was not immune. Over the centuries, a tragic pattern emerged. A few righteous kings would rise, attempting to restore pure worship and remove the idols, only to be followed by a succession of wicked rulers who actively promoted the worship of pagan gods. Can you imagine the spiritual tension in the air? Prophets, chosen by God, stood as lonely voices crying out in the wilderness, warning of impending judgment, pleading with the people to return to the Lord. But their words, often met with scorn and persecution, seemed to fall on deaf ears. The heart of the problem was this: the people began to believe that the mere existence of the temple, God's physical dwelling place, guaranteed their safety regardless of their actions. They treated it as a magical charm, a shield against judgment, even as they filled its courtyards with pagan altars and offered sacrifices to foreign deities. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, delivered God's chilling message to the people standing at the temple gates. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, then I will allow you to live in this place. Jeremiah 7, verses 4 through 7. It was a stark warning, a divine ultimatum. True worship was not about location, but about the condition of the heart. But the people remained stubbornly resistant, their hearts hardened by repeated sin. The spiritual decay was rampant. Kings like Manasseh, Judah's most wicked king, rebuilt the pagan altars his father Hezekiah had destroyed, erected altars to Baal, set up Asherah poles, and even sacrificed his own son in the fire. He built altars to all the starry hosts in the two courts of the Lord's temple and placed an Asherah pole in the very house of God. Imagine the horror. The sacred precincts of the temple, once filled with divine glory, now defiled by abominable practices. The spiritual forces of evil, once kept at bay by fervent worship, now seemed to gain a foothold, manipulating the very rulers and hearts of the people. This wasn't merely religious backsliding, it was an open rebellion against the God who had chosen Jerusalem as his dwelling place. Yet even as the shadow deepened, God in his boundless patience continued to send prophets: Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, each warning, each offering a path to repentance, each revealing the inevitable consequences of their persistent rebellion. They spoke of a coming storm, a devastating judgment that would sweep away the defilement, a consequence of breaking the very covenant that sustained them. They prophesied of a fierce foreign power that would come to execute God's wrath, an instrument of divine discipline. The Babylonians, a formidable empire, were rising in the east, an unstoppable force, a clear and present danger to a Judah steeped in idolatry. The final act of this tragic drama unfolded under King Zedekiah, a puppet king placed on the throne by Babylon itself. Despite repeated warnings from Jeremiah to submit to Babylon and preserve the city, Zedekiah foolishly rebelled, trusting in the empty promises of Egypt. This act of defiance sealed Jerusalem's fate. The storm clouds gathered, and finally Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king of Babylon, marched his armies against Jerusalem. The city, once considered invincible, was besieged. For over a year and a half, the people endured unimaginable suffering, famine, disease, and the constant threat of invasion. Can you imagine the desperate cries from within the city walls, the hunger pains, the fading hope as the powerful Babylonian siege machines relentlessly battered their defenses? And then the inevitable. In 586 BC, the 11th year of Zedekiah's reign, the walls of Jerusalem were breached. The city fell. What happened next was a scene of utter devastation, a profound spiritual trauma that would echo through generations. The Babylonian soldiers poured into the city, mercilessly slaughtering its inhabitants, including the king's sons before his very eyes, before blinding him and taking him in chains to Babylon. The once glorious Temple of Solomon, the symbol of God's dwelling place, was plundered, its sacred vessels carried away, and then, in a heartbreaking act of destruction, it was set on fire and reduced to ashes. The very house that once shimmered with God's glory now stood as a smoldering ruin, a testament to broken promises and divine judgment. Smoke choked the sky, obscuring the setting sun. The city, once vibrant and bustling, was left desolate, its magnificent walls torn down, its palaces and houses burned. Thousands of survivors were torn from their homes, bound in chains, and forcibly marched on a grueling journey to exile in Babylon. The covenant felt shattered. Had God abandoned them forever? Had his promises failed? This wasn't just the fall of a city or an empire. It was the spiritual heart of a nation being ripped out, a profound moment of reckoning, a stark reminder that God's covenant is not unconditional. His love endures forever, but his justice demands a response to rebellion. As the last remnants of the exiles disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind only the smoldering ruins of their beloved city, a haunting question lingered. What now? Was this the end of Jerusalem's story? The end of God's chosen people? Or was this devastating judgment, this fiery trial, part of a larger, mysterious divine plan? A painful pruning designed to bring forth a future harvest? The answer was not immediately clear, but etched in the ashes was a promise, a whisper of hope that even in the darkest night, God's purposes would prevail. The stage was now set for the long, arduous journey of exile, a period of profound reflection, desperate longing, and the slow, painful rediscovery of what it truly meant to be God's people. Imagine a people, torn from their homeland, stripped of their identity, and forced to live as captives in a foreign land. Their glorious city, Jerusalem, reduced to rubble, their magnificent temple, the very dwelling place of God's glory, a smoldering ruin. This was the reality for the exiles in Babylon, a profound period of national mourning and spiritual reckoning. What if I told you that in this seemingly hopeless captivity, amidst the deep despair and yearning for their lost home, a new kind of faith was forged, and the whispers of divine promise began to break through the silence? The scene is vivid. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Psalm 137:1. Can you feel the weight of their sorrow? They hung their harps on the willows, unable to sing the Lord's songs in a foreign land. Their captors demanded joyous melodies, but how could they sing when their hearts were shattered, when Jerusalem, their beloved city, lay desolate? This wasn't just physical displacement, it was a spiritual agony, a profound sense of abandonment. Every day was a stark reminder of their collective failure, their stubborn rebellion against the God who had chosen them. Yet even in the depths of despair, God had not abandoned his people. His prophets, though often rejected in Jerusalem, continued to speak words of both judgment and hope to the exiles. Jeremiah, still in the land, sent a letter to the captives in Babylon with a shocking message: "Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. This was a promise of restoration, a blueprint for hope in the midst of hopelessness. God explicitly stated the duration of their exile: 70 years. Jeremiah 29:10. This wasn't an arbitrary number, it was a fixed divine decree, a period of discipline and purification. Can you imagine the discussions among the exiles? 70 years, a generation. Could they truly believe such a promise after losing everything? Yet this prophetic word became an anchor for their hope, a countdown to a promised return. Among the exiles, a young man named Daniel stood out. Uprooted from Jerusalem as a teenager, he remained steadfast in his devotion to God amidst the pagan splendor of Babylon. God granted him extraordinary wisdom and the gift of interpreting dreams and visions, revealing the course of future empires and events, including the downfall of Babylon itself. As the 70 years drew to a close, Daniel, understanding the timing of God's prophecy, turned to fervent prayer, confessing the sins of his people and pleading for Jerusalem's restoration. His prayer was a powerful act of faith, a spiritual activation of God's promise. And then, in a twist of history that only God could orchestrate, the world shifted. Babylon, the mighty empire that had crushed Jerusalem, fell. But it didn't fall to another brutal conqueror. It fell to a new, rising power, Persia. And at the head of this new empire was an extraordinary figure, King Cyrus the Great. What you're about to discover is nothing short of astonishing. This man, a pagan king, was named by the prophet Isaiah over 150 years before his birth as God's shepherd, who would fulfill all my purpose and declare to Jerusalem, "You will be rebuilt," and to the temple, "Your foundations will be laid." Even more remarkably, Isaiah 45 verse 1 records God calling Cyrus his anointed. Think about the paradox: a foreign emperor, a pagan, carrying a title usually reserved for the Messiah, becoming God's instrument of deliverance. This revealed how far God's hand can reach, how he can use even those outside the covenant to fulfill his divine plan. In 538 BC, King Cyrus issued a decree, Ezra 1 verses 1 through 4, that stunned the Jewish exiles. They were free to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of the Lord. Not only did he permit their return, but he also provided financial support from the royal treasury and restored the sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had plundered from the first temple. Can you imagine the overwhelming joy, the tears of relief, the disbelief that this impossible dream was actually coming true? After decades of despair, the glimmer of hope transformed into the dawn of restoration. The first wave of exiles, led by Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, and Joshua the high priest, began the long and arduous journey back to Jerusalem. The city they returned to was a desolate wasteland, its walls broken, its houses in ruins, its sacred ground overgrown with weeds. This was not the glorious city they had dreamed of. It was a daunting task, fraught with challenges: opposition from neighboring peoples who feared a strong Jewish presence, and apathy among their own people who had grown comfortable in exile. Yet, fueled by the prophetic words of Haggai and Zechariah, they laid the foundations of the Second Temple. This was not merely a rebuilding of stones and mortar, it was a rebuilding of hope, a restoration of identity, a reestablishment of the covenant. The return from Babylon was a profound testimony to God's faithfulness. Even when his people rebelled and faced judgment, his promises endured. He remembered his covenant, and he brought them back, just as he had promised. The weeping by the rivers of Babylon slowly turned into songs of rejoicing as the sounds of construction once again echoed through the valleys of Jerusalem. The city, though still a shadow of its former glory, was awakening, signaling that God's story for his chosen place was far from over. What awaited this resurrected city? And how would its story continue to unfold, weaving through history and pointing to a final, ultimate fulfillment? The answers lay in the struggles and triumphs of the future, leading to an unexpected culmination. Imagine a city rebuilt, not with the dazzling splendor of old, but with the grit and determination of a people reborn from the ashes of exile. A city whose very existence was a testament to God's enduring faithfulness, a defiant beacon of hope in a world of shifting empires. This was Jerusalem after the return from Babylon, a city entering a new chapter, a period where its destiny would continue to unfold, leading ultimately to a convergence of history and prophecy unlike anything the world has ever witnessed. What if I told you that this city, having endured destruction and exile, was destined not only for restoration, but for an ultimate climactic role in God's final plan for humanity? The rebuilding of the Second Temple, though less grand than Solomon's, was a monumental act of faith. Led by Zerubbabel and later strengthened by the leadership of Ezra, who focused on spiritual renewal, and Nehemiah, who tirelessly rebuilt the city walls amidst fierce opposition, Jerusalem began to breathe again. Can you imagine the dedication of Nehemiah, enduring threats and ridicule as he rallied the people to rebuild the broken defenses of their beloved city, each worker holding a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other? Nehemiah 4:17-18. This was more than construction, it was the re-establishment of a physical and spiritual boundary, a declaration that Jerusalem was God's city, protected by His hand. For centuries after the Second Temple was completed, Jerusalem entered a period of relative silence in the biblical narrative, known as the intertestamental period. Empires rose and fell, Persian, Greek, Roman, each casting its shadow over the Holy Land. Yet Jerusalem, a resilient survivor, continued to endure, waiting for its next, most profound chapter. This was a time of patient anticipation, a quiet unfolding of God's timing, setting the stage for the arrival of the one who would forever change its destiny. And then the king arrived, not in the splendor of an earthly monarch, but in the humble guise of a carpenter from Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth. Jerusalem became the central stage for his earthly ministry. He taught in its temple courts, healed the sick in its streets, and wept over its spiritual blindness, prophesying its future destruction. Luke 19:41-44. Can you imagine the spiritual tension during his visits? The clash between divine truth and human tradition, the whispers of prophetic fulfillment echoing through its ancient alleys. It was in Jerusalem that Jesus faced betrayal, endured his trial, was crucified on a hill just outside its walls, and 3 days later rose triumphantly from the dead, conquering sin and death. This was the ultimate fulfillment of prophecy, the shedding of his blood for the sins of the world, making Jerusalem the epicenter of salvation history. But Jerusalem's role didn't end with the resurrection. 50 days later, on the day of Pentecost, in an upper room in Jerusalem, the Holy Spirit descended like fire upon his disciples, empowering them to carry heaven's message to a hostile world. The church, born in Jerusalem, Acts 2, became the continuation of God's covenant, extending his salvation to every nation. From Jerusalem, the gospel spread like wildfire, transforming lives and reshaping history. But history, like prophecy, does not stand still. Just as Jesus prophesied, Jerusalem faced another devastating destruction in 70 AD when the Roman armies besieged and destroyed the city and its Second Temple, fulfilling the warnings of a rebellious people. The temple was once again reduced to rubble, a physical symbol of a spiritual reality. So, is that the end of Jerusalem's story? Has its destiny been fully realized? Far from it, because even now as the world fixates on military strategies and global alliances, Jerusalem remains the heartbeat of prophecy, the eye of the storm. The Bible, in its divine foresight, thunders about Jerusalem's future role, a role far grander and more climactic than its past. The very sources we've examined hint at this profound truth. Consider the words of the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 38, speaking of a vast coalition that will rise against Israel in the last days, one name standing prominently among them: Persia, modern-day Iran. This is not just a geopolitical forecast, it's a revelation of an ancient spiritual war, a spiritual war disguised as politics. The chants echoing from Tehran today, "Death to Israel," are not just political slogans, they are the voice of a spirit that has warred against God's covenant people for generations. The sources tell us that Iran, once God's instrument for Israel's restoration through kings like Cyrus and moments like Esther's deliverance, has now twisted into a spiritual rebellion, destined to be a frontline figure in the war between rebellion and redemption. And what is the spark that ignites this final monumental conflict? The very city we've been exploring. Zechariah 14:4 paints a chillingly clear picture of the climactic moment. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west. This is not allegory, it's geographical prophecy, a literal return, a divine descent. The Mount of Olives, the very place where Jesus once ascended into heaven, is the exact location where he will return. Can you imagine the earth trembling under his feet, splitting open the ground, while the armies of darkness look on in stunned silence? The conflict will not be about oil, economics, or land, but over the throne of divine authority. God himself declares in 2 Chronicles 6:6, "But now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I have chosen David to rule my people Israel." That's not a political statement, that's a divine claim. If he chose it, who can unchoose it? If his name is written there, what missile can erase it? The conflict between Israel and Iran today, the threats, the shifting alliances, is only the surface of a much deeper, more ancient battle waged by invisible forces. It's a spiritual war empowered by a darkness rooted in rebellion against God's covenant. Because Israel is not just a flag or a people, it is a symbol, a living testimony that God's promises still stand, that the covenant he made with Abraham has not been erased. Every arrow launched at Israel is ultimately aimed at God himself. History confirms it. Every empire that lifted its hand against Israel eventually crumbled. So as the conflict intensifies, as Iran edges ever closer to Israel's borders, and the drumbeats of war echo louder across the land, don't let your eyes stop at what is visible. See the battle behind the battle. What is unfolding before us is not merely political or territorial. It is prophetic, it is spiritual, and it has already been witnessed not just by prophets, but by the eyes of heaven itself. This is a prophetic hour, one that demands the full attention of the body of Christ. The church was born in Jerusalem, and now, as prophecy bends once again toward that sacred city, we are called to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Psalm 122:6. This is not a political suggestion, it is spiritual obedience, praying for the unfolding of God's covenant, the protection of his people, and the return of his Son. Jerusalem's story is not simply history repeating itself. It is a mirror of the spiritual realm, a revelation that the covenant of God cannot be touched, even when the nations rage. The war may rage, but the victory has already been written, and soon the author of that victory will return. The kingdoms of this world will fall, the nations will tremble, and the Mount of Olives will once again feel the weight of the King's return. The one who split the sea will split the sky. The one who wore thorns will wear a crown. The one who died will reign forever. Jerusalem, God's chosen city, stands as an eternal testament to his unwavering promises. A city whose destiny is intertwined with the very fabric of redemption, leading to a glorious, victorious culmination. Stay awake. Stay anchored in the Word. Stand in prayer for Jerusalem. The battle is real, the time is short, and the King is coming.